So I wanted to talk about sort of how to approach talking to your kids when the other parent is an abuser. And I do want to preface this by saying you should be getting to an attorney and then following their instructions, doing what they say. That is going to be your most important thing. But I wanted to sort of just give you some guidelines, ones that I followed when I was in this situation. And that is, we want to thread the needle between not vilifying the other parent to the child or children, but also letting them know that there is a danger element. And so, for example, when I was growing up, my dad never said anything about my mom. I had no idea that she was not a safe person. So when I got kicked out of foster care and I was trying to think of like, okay, well, where can I go? And I thought, okay, well, why don't I try living with my mom? I'd never lived with my mom. And so my dad said something very cryptic. He said, if you ever need a place to stay, I'll be here. And I was like, you're tripping. The reason I'm in foster care is because this man tried to murder me. So I was like, why would he say this? And then a month of living with my mother, and I understood, but I had not been prepared. So I was attempting to make decisions about what I should be doing in my life and for my own safety, and I did not have enough information to make those choices. So it's you don't want to vilify the other parent, but at the same time you want to let your kids know that there's an issue. And the thing is, the reason why we don't want to vilify the other parent is that when you do that, you're actually influencing the way your child will see themselves or eventually see themselves. So, for example, if I remember correctly, studies show that same sex child to parent, that they model their identity off of that parent. And then in terms of the opposite sex parent, they are going to model their future relationship partner off of that parent. So if you are speaking badly about the other parent in a very comprehensive, intense way, they may interpret that to mean that there's something wrong about their own identity, because kids don't have the same boundaries adults do in terms of like who I am and who you are, or about their like future partner. So one way to approach it, and the way that I ended up approaching it quite a bit, my son was pretty young at the time, and I essentially just let him know, like, hey, your father is not making his best choices. Some of these choices are not safe choices. And so what we're doing is we are setting boundaries to help him make his best choices. So it was letting him know there's an issue here that we need to be aware of. um, that we need to be aware of, but it's not portraying his, other parent in a way that is emotionally damaging to him. And so this is essentially kind of like the line I think is like a good line to walk. It doesn't put you in parental alienation territory, but it also doesn't keep your kids oblivious as to what's going on. So I'll give you another example. I found out Steven Spielberg, he'd made all of these movies about how about fathers who abandon their kids, and he clearly has some kind of like father wound. And it turns out apparently his mom cheated on his dad, but the dad didn't want to say anything about the mom because he didn't want to damage his son's relationship with his mother. And so he spent his entire adult life, his entire creative life, processing this story that was not true. And then how many of us watch those stories, right? So the truth needs to have a place in the discussion, but it's got to be in an age appropriate way. You don't want your kids to be involved in like a mob mentality toward that other parent, but at the same time they need to know what is safe, what's appropriate, what's not okay. And sometimes I think depending on what their behavior is, you might contextualize it and say, well, they're not being safe with me. Let's say there's I don't know, let's say there's something like cheating. They are not making safe choices as far as you're concerned, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are being a bad parent or not making safe choices for the children. That said, if they're introducing these people to the children, that's a different discussion and is going to be very context dependent. So sometimes you might end up, well, let me back it up. you do not want to control or attempt to control how your children think. We didn't like it when we were kids, and it's not fair to do it to our own children. That said, that may mean that your kids may not agree with you, because they don't understand the totality of the circumstances. And so this is one of those situations where no matter what is happening, the truth is still true. Reality is still real. And they may think things in a direction that's not necessarily accurate toward you or fair toward you. And you just got to do your best moving forward in as fair a way as possible. That's not controlling, but also like you are setting boundaries for yourself. So, for example, if your kids don't agree with you and then they are basically verbally abusive and yelling at you, no. That's not okay. That's not appropriate. That's not how we talk to each other in this family. So you can set boundaries in terms of how they communicate those things to you, just as if it were any other topic, and those boundaries show what safety looks like. You are free to express things to me. You may not express them to me in a harmful way. And then if there needs to be more of a discussion, we can go to therapy. As your kids get older, they may be resistant to that. I feel like everybody's resistant to therapy, like especially the people who need it. And it's crazy. When I was a kid and I did eventually end up in kid therapy, it was great. There were toys. I barely knew I was in therapy. I thought I was hanging out with an adult and I got a play person to play with. And it was like all new toys in a totally different environment. And that person was very nurturing. So kid therapy is not, generally speaking, not going to be bad. A lot of therapists who are working with children are very committed to being present with them and to being a safe adult that they can process things with. So sometimes for adults, we run into problems with getting a good therapist. But I find, broadly speaking, that child therapists tend to be very, very committed to child welfare and to being a safe person for that child. So I have much less reservations as far as that's concerned. But just in general, you don't want to completely vilify the other parent. You don't want to not let them know what's happening. We're looking for that middle path that also models good boundaries. And it also communicates to them, because again, the kids, they don't have that separation of me and another person per se. So they may look at how you treat the other parent and think, oh, if I mess up, that's how my parent's going to, treat me. So in your mind, you're thinking, well, this other parent deserves it. And they probably do, but the kid's looking at you and watching what you're doing, to the extent that you're making that visible to them. So the high road does not necessarily have immediate returns. That's one of those things that is a long game, and you may not win those short battles. And you just have to have faith that the truth is still true. And also, I personally would keep the receipts so that you can show later when they're older. Sometimes your kids may ask you specific questions that are fair questions to ask, but are not age appropriate for them at that time. And so 100%, I've said to my child, I cannot answer that question for you now. It would not be fair for me to do that. It would not help you to know this at this point. I will answer that question in the future. And I usually give like an age. Like I'll answer that question at 16. I'll answer that question at 18. So he feels that there is I'm not putting him off just because. There's a point at which he can ask that question. And honestly, when we get there, he may have forgotten that he wanted to know it. But, always keeping in mind what is best for their sense of their own development as a person, regardless of how it feels, because you're dealing with this abuser. Now, if you're dealing with somebody who you are concerned like for your life and the life of your children, that needs to be handled very carefully. They need to know that they are in danger like that. Or they need to be in a position where they cannot contact that parent at all. However you thread this specific needle, I would do it with the help of a shelter. I would do it with the help of attorneys. I would do it with the help of a domestic violence restraining order. It Leaving kids in the dark is not good for them, but giving them too much information is also not good for them. So if you're in that sort of in between kind of place where you're not worried about getting murdered, you're not really worried about your kids getting murdered, sort of broadly speaking about the topic, I think can work. If, however, you're concerned about that level of violence, you've got to be so very, very careful. And you may not even want to tip your kids off at all, period, point blank, until you have removed everybody from the situation, because it's sometimes safer for them not to know in the very short term. So this is all extremely, you got to be extremely thoughtful, extremely thinking of, like, extremely strategic and thinking of the angles. And again, I highly recommend speaking to a professional. I recommend speaking to an attorney. The more serious your situation, the more you need to be talking to these people, because they are going to let you know kind of the boundaries that you're working with, especially legally. So anyway, I hope this helps, and I'll talk to you next time.